Imagine for a moment that you're dying. Your heart stops beating, your breathing stops, and the doctors declare there's nothing more that can be done. For 28 minutes, you no longer exist in this world. But then something impossible happens. This is the true story of a man who defied death and returned to tell what he saw on the other side. A journey that began with a devastating lightning strike and ended with revelations that challenge everything we thought we knew about life and death. Get ready to experience the most shocking experience ever reported about what really happens when we die. If you want to discover the secrets of the beyond and how this experience completely transformed the life of an ordinary man, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any detail of this extraordinary story. The year was 1975, and Dannion Brinkley lived a perfectly ordinary life. He woke up every morning like any other typical American, never imagining for a second that in a few hours his existence would take a completely different turn. It was just another day, or so he thought. Dark clouds began to gather in the sky during the afternoon, painting the horizon with menacing hues. The air was heavy, as if nature itself were preparing something monumentally powerful. The storm approached with a force few can predict or comprehend. Dannion couldn't know it, but at that very moment, millions of volts of electricity were concentrated in the clouds above his head. Nature was about to unleash a force so brutal and devastating that it would change not just one life, but challenge everything humanity believes about death and consciousness. And then it happened. A flash of lightning split the sky with indescribable violence. The bolt descended from the heavens like a spear of pure fire, finding its target with surgical and relentless precision. The electrical discharge pierced Dannion's skull and traveled down his spine in a split second, transforming his body into a human conduit for a force of nature. The impact was instantaneous and absolute. In a matter of seconds, everything went completely dark. Dannion's body, still radiating heat from the electric shock he had just received, collapsed to the ground like a rag doll. There was no movement, there was no breathing, there was no life. At that precise moment, Dannion Brinkley died, but this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything we thought we knew about reality, consciousness, and the mystery of death. What happened in the next 28 minutes would forever change our understanding of what it means to be alive, and what happens when we're no longer alive. The force of the electric shock that tore through Dannion's body was so devastating that his vital organs simply ceased to function. His heart, which had beaten millions of times throughout his life, stopped instantly. His lungs, which had been breathing automatically since the moment he was born, became completely immobile. Paramedics arrived quickly on the scene, but what they found was a scene they were all too familiar with. Dannion lay on the ground, his body completely inert with no sign of life. They attempted every emergency procedure known to modern medicine: CPR, defibrillation, adrenaline. Everything was administered with the precision and urgency that moments like these require. But nothing worked. The medical equipment confirmed what the professionals already knew. There was no pulse, no heartbeat, no breathing. Vital signs were a flat, silent line on the monitors. After exhaustive attempts and rigorously followed protocols, the medical verdict was delivered with the clinical coolness that the profession demands. Dannion Brinkley was dead. The protocol was clear and inevitable. His body would be transported to the morgue, that cold, silent place reserved for those who never return. It was the final destination, the point of no return that all human beings eventually face. The doctors filled out the paperwork, recorded the official time of death, and went about their daily routines. For them, it was another closed case, another life that modern medicine couldn't save. Dannion had become just another statistic in the hospital records. But as his body was being prepared for transport to the morgue, something extraordinary was happening in a dimension that science cannot yet fully explain. Within that icy silence of death, within that absolute stillness that marks the end of a life, the impossible was preparing to happen. The next 28 minutes would be the most important of Dannion Brinkley's existence. 28 minutes that would challenge everything we know about consciousness, the soul, and the continuity of life after the death of the physical body. 28 minutes that would become the portal to the most impressive and transformative experience a human being had ever experienced. As doctors officially abandoned their resuscitation attempts and prepared to declare him dead, something utterly inexplicable began to happen to Dannion Brinkley. In a moment that defied all scientific and medical logic, he began experiencing something that would forever change his understanding of the nature of human consciousness. Suddenly, without any rational explanation, Dannion found himself observing everything from above. He was no longer trapped in that inert, lifeless body lying on the hospital gurney. He no longer felt the weight of physical matter, no longer limited by the boundaries of flesh and blood. It was as if he had transformed into pure consciousness, into an essence that could observe and understand without relying on traditional physical senses. From above, with a crystal clarity he'd never experienced in his life, Dannion could see the entire scene unfolding below him. Healthcare workers scurried back and forth, their faces etched with urgency and then mounting frustration. He saw machines being turned off one by one, equipment being removed, procedures being halted. He witnessed the exact moment the doctors looked at each other and shook their heads in resignation. He saw them check their watches to officially record the time of death. He watched as they covered his body with a white sheet, the fabric that symbolizes the end of all earthly journeys. He was a spectator of his own death. The utter strangeness of the situation was accompanied by a completely paradoxical and unexpected sensation. There was no pain. There was no despair. There was none of the terror one would expect from someone who had just died. Instead, a deep, inexplicable peace took over his entire being. It was a mental clarity that transcended anything I had ever experienced in life. Every thought was sharp, every perception amplified. I could understand not only what was happening, but also the emotions and thoughts of those around me. It was as if all the limitations of human perception had been removed at once. In that extraordinary state, Dannion began to realize that consciousness didn't depend on the physical brain to exist, that the mind, the soul, the essence of who we truly are, could continue to function even when the body was completely dead. And then, as he watched the preparations to take his body to the morgue, something even more astonishing began to happen. He started to walk away, further and further away from the hospital room, further and further away from the physical reality he had known all his life, towards something that would forever change his understanding of what lies beyond death. As Dannion moved further and further away from the hospital scene, something beyond human description began to manifest before him. On the horizon of this new reality, a light began to appear, but it was no ordinary light, not merely a physical glow like anything that could be compared to earthly lights. This light was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. It was a luminous presence that radiated an indescribable energy, a force that seemed to contain within itself all the love, understanding, and wisdom of the universe. It wasn't harsh on the eyes, as one would expect from something so intense, but rather soft and welcoming, as if each ray of light were a gentle invitation to draw near. Dannion felt irresistibly drawn to this extraordinary light. It wasn't a physical attraction, but something much deeper, as if every fiber of his consciousness recognized this presence as something familiar, something that had always been waiting for this encounter. As he approached, the light began to communicate with him, But not through words, not through sound or language as we know it. The communication occurred directly within consciousness, through pure feelings, through instant knowledge, through an understanding that completely dispensed with the need for verbal explanations. It was as if that light knew every moment of her life, every thought she had ever had, every emotion she had ever felt. And yet, instead of judgment, there was only acceptance. Instead of condemnation, there was understanding. Instead of fear, there was an unconditional love that enveloped her entire being like an infinite embrace. Approaching that light was like returning to a home he had forgotten existed. It was as if finally, after a lifetime of searching and questioning, something inside him made complete sense. All the doubts, all the anxieties, all the fears he had carried throughout his earthly existence simply dissolved before that loving presence. The light began to show him things his human mind could never have conceived. Revelations about the nature of existence, the purpose of life, and the continuity of consciousness after physical death. Knowledge that didn't come through words or concepts, but was simply absorbed directly into his essence. It was an experience that completely transcended the limits of human description, something words could never fully capture. It was pure feeling, pure understanding, pure connection with something infinitely greater than anything I had ever imagined possible. In that sacred moment, Dannion understood that death was not the end, but a transformation. That life continued in forms and dimensions the human mind can barely fathom. And then, when it seemed like I would remain in that state of absolute ecstasy forever, something unexpected happened. The light began to move away, and he felt himself being pulled back. In the cold, silent hospital morgue, where the bodies of those who never return rest on their final journey, something utterly impossible was about to happen. Dannion Brinkley's body had been lying on the metal table for exactly 28 minutes, covered by the white sheet that officially marks the end of a life. The morgue staff followed their routine protocols, preparing for the standard procedures that precede funeral arrangements. It was just another body, another entry in the death records. The paperwork was completed, the cause of death documented, and everything followed the normal and predictable course of these final moments. But then, in a split second that defied all laws of medicine and biology, Dannion's chest moved. A breath. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. The employees looked at each other with expressions of utter disbelief. Surely it was a hoax, an illusion, perhaps gases moving through the lifeless body. The dead don't breathe. The dead don't come back. This was an unquestionable scientific truth. But then it happened again. Another breath, this time stronger, more evident, and then another. The impossible was happening before his eyes. The dead man was breathing again. In a mix of terror and fascination, the staff immediately called the doctors. Within minutes, the medical team that had officially declared Dannion dead was back, facing a situation that contradicted everything they had learned in their careers. The monitors were quickly reconnected. And then, to the utter shock of everyone present, vital signs began to appear on the screens. Weak at first, but gradually strengthening. The heart had resumed beating, the lungs were functioning again, the brain showed activity. Dannion Brinkley was alive. The shock among the medical team was palpable. Experienced doctors, who had witnessed thousands of deaths throughout their careers, were completely speechless. How could they scientifically explain what had just happened? How could a man who had been clinically dead for 28 minutes simply come back to life? It was as if he had been brought back against all odds, against all natural laws, as if he still had something important to accomplish in this earthly life. But Dannion's return to the world of the living was not a complete miracle. His body had paid a terrible price for those 28 minutes of death. The damage caused by the lightning and the prolonged shutdown of vital organs was extensive and devastating. When he finally opened his eyes, Dannion was faced with a brutal reality. He couldn't move any part of his body. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in his own flesh like a prisoner in a physical jail. But in his mind, the memories of that extraordinary journey remained crystal clear and vivid. He had returned from beyond with a mission and a story that would change the lives of millions of people around the world. Returning to life didn't bring Dannion Brinkley the relief expected of someone escaping death. On the contrary, what awaited him was a physical and emotional battle that would test every fiber of his resolve and willpower. The cruel reality was that, although his consciousness had returned completely intact from that extraordinary journey, his body had been ravaged by the experience. For 6 long, agonizing days, Dannion remained completely paralyzed. He couldn't move his arms, his legs, or even turn his head. It was as if his soul were trapped in a physical shell that no longer responded to his commands. Every attempt to move resulted in nothing but frustration and growing despair. The pain was constant and excruciating. His nervous system, severely damaged by the electrical discharge, sent signals of agony coursing through his body. It was a pain unlike anything he had ever experienced in life, a pain that seemed to burn from the very core of every cell, constantly reminding him of the price he had paid for his journey to the afterlife. Doctors were cautious in their predictions. The neurological damage was extensive, and the chances of a full recovery were virtually non-existent, according to the medical knowledge of the time. Many believed Dannion would spend the rest of his life confined to that wheelchair, completely dependent on the help of others for the most basic functions of life. But Dannion carried with him something the doctors could not measure or quantify: the vivid memories of his near-death experience, the absolute clarity of what he had seen and felt in that dimension beyond physical life, served as an internal fuel, a source of determination that transcended the limitations imposed by his wounded body. Then began a rehabilitation journey that would be as epic as his spiritual experience. 7 months of intensive physical therapy, experimental treatments, painful exercises, and endless rehabilitation sessions. Each small regained movement was a monumental victory. Each muscle that began to respond again was celebrated as a personal miracle. The physical therapy sessions were brutal. Atrophied muscles needed to be forced to work again. Damaged neural connections had to find new pathways to transmit signals from the brain to the rest of the body. It was like relearning how to be human, like rebuilding the bridge between mind and matter from scratch. For 2 long years, Dannion struggled daily against the limitations of his own body. There were days of impressive progress where he could move a finger or flex a muscle that seemed dead forever. But there were also days of devastating setbacks, where it seemed all the progress he had made had been lost. With each step he took, Dannion literally carried with him not only the physical weight of recovery, but also the emotional and spiritual responsibility of sharing with the world what he had experienced in those extraordinary 28 minutes, because he knew his return had not been accidental. He had been sent back with a mission, and nothing would stop him from fulfilling the purpose that had been revealed to him in the light. As Dannion Brinkley struggled daily to regain control of his physical body, an even more profound transformation took place in his mind and spirit. The near-death experience was not just an isolated event in his life. It had become the foundation for a new understanding of human existence that would radically change the way he saw the world. The first and most impactful revelation he carried with him was the absolute certainty that consciousness does not end with the death of the physical body. During those 28 minutes, he was clinically dead. His mind had functioned with a clarity and breadth he had never experienced in life. This was not theory or philosophical speculation. It was direct, first-hand knowledge. The body, Dannion understood, was merely a temporary shell, a vehicle the soul uses during its earthly experience. Physical death did not represent the end of existence, but rather a transition to other dimensions of reality that the ordinary human mind can barely glimpse. This understanding completely removed from his consciousness the fear of death that haunts most human beings. How could anyone fear something they had already experienced and discovered to be a transformation rather than a destruction? Death had become for him no longer an enemy to be avoided, but a natural and inevitable passage that everyone would eventually pass through. But the revelations received during his extraordinary journey went far beyond the nature of death. The light he had communicated with had imparted profound insights into the purpose and meaning of human life. Every action, every thought, every act of kindness or cruelty we perform during our time on Earth has a far greater impact than we can imagine. Dannion had understood that there is a fundamental interconnection between all living beings, an invisible web that connects each individual consciousness to the universal whole. When we hurt someone, we hurt ourselves. When we love someone, we strengthen the entire network of consciousness that permeates existence. The responsibility this entailed was both terrifying and inspiring. Every choice we make resonates through dimensions we cannot see, affecting not only our own spiritual journey, but also the collective evolution of humanity. This realization completely transformed the hierarchy of values in his life. The material concerns that had previously seemed so important, money, social status, possessions, were revealed to be temporary illusions without any real meaning. What truly mattered was the development of compassion, unconditional love, and spiritual understanding. Dannion began to see each person he interacted with not just as a separate individual, but as part of this great web of consciousness of which we are all a part. Each encounter became an opportunity to practice the love he had experienced in the presence of that extraordinary light. The physical pain of his recovery, intense as it was, paled in comparison to the spiritual urgency that now consumed him. He knew he had been sent back for a specific purpose, and each day of suffering brought him closer to being physically capable of fulfilling that mission. In his heart, a certainty grew every day. His story was not just his, but belonged to the entire world. After years of physical recovery and spiritual transformation, Dannion Brinkley came to a realization that would not only change the course of his own life, but also profoundly affect the lives of millions of people around the world. His extraordinary experience was not a personal gift, but rather a universal responsibility that needed to be shared with humanity. The certainty that he must tell his story to the world grew within him like an inextinguishable flame. It wasn't a choice, but a calling that echoed from the depths of his transformed soul. The light he had found during his journey to the beyond had given him more than knowledge. It had planted a mission that transcended any personal consideration. He then decided to start writing. His first attempts were hesitant and emotionally devastating. How could he put into words an experience that completely transcended the limits of human language? How could he describe feelings that had no equivalent in ordinary earthly experience? How could he convince a skeptical world that death was not the end but merely a transformation? Each written page was a battle between the limitations of words and the infinity of lived experience. But gradually, with unwavering determination, Dannion managed to create a narrative that, while a pale representation of the reality he had experienced, managed to convey the transformative essence of his journey. When he finally published his first book, the reaction was explosive and polarized. Skeptics and materialists attacked his credibility, questioning the veracity of his experience and attributing it all to hallucinations caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain. But for every critic, there were hundreds of people deeply touched by his words. The interviews began to multiply. Television programs, radio stations, magazines and newspapers vied for the opportunity to speak with the man who had died and returned to tell his story. Each public appearance was an opportunity to plant seeds of hope in hearts that had long ago lost faith in the continuity of existence. Dannion then began touring the world, giving lectures. Crowded auditoriums of people of all ages, religions and cultures gathered to hear his testimony. Catholics and Protestants, Jews and Muslims, Buddhists and Hindus, agnostics and even atheists found something universal in his message that transcended dogmatic and cultural barriers. It was extraordinary to witness the impact her words had. People who lived in terror of their own imminent death found peace and acceptance. Family members who had lost loved ones found solace in the knowledge that the separation was only temporary. Individuals who had lost the meaning of life rediscovered purpose and meaning in their lives. His lectures became true events of collective healing. It was not uncommon to see entire audiences in tears, not of sadness, but of relief and reconnection with something sacred they had forgotten existed within themselves. The message Dannion carried was simple yet revolutionary. Death is not the end. Love is the most powerful force in the universe, and every life has a sacred purpose that transcends the material appearances of earthly existence. And as his message spread around the world, something extraordinary began to happen. Other people began sharing their own near-death experiences, creating a global movement of spiritual awakening. More than simply talking about his extraordinary experience, Dannion Brinkley had become a living embodiment of the lessons he had learned during those 28 transformative minutes in the afterlife. His life was no longer just a verbal testimony, but a practical demonstration of how a human being can live when they truly understand the sacred nature of existence. Each morning he awoke was a priceless gift to him. The days that had previously passed, unnoticed amidst the mundane routine, now shone with a special luminosity, as if each moment were a unique and unrepeatable opportunity to experience the magic of being alive. The simple act of breathing, which for most people is automatic and unconscious, had become for Dannion a constant celebration of the miracle of life. His human relationships underwent a radical transformation. Where once there had been superficial and mechanical interactions, deep and meaningful connections now flourished. Dannion had learned to see beyond social masks and constructed personalities, perceiving in each person the divine essence he had recognized within himself during his encounter with the light. Patience had become his most defining characteristic. Situations that would previously have angered or frustrated him were now met with an almost transcendental serenity. He understood that every challenge, every difficulty, every apparent injustice was part of a larger learning experience that we can't always perceive with our limited eyes. Forgiveness flowed from his heart like an inexhaustible fountain. Not just forgiveness for those who had hurt him in the past, but a preemptive and unconditional forgiveness for all the human failings he witnessed around him. He had understood that judging others was judging aspects of himself he had not yet fully accepted. The trivialities that drain most people's energy completely lost their power over Dannion. Discussions of partisan politics, social gossip, and competition for status or public recognition seemed like childish games to him compared to the grandeur of the true purpose of human existence. Instead, he developed an insatiable hunger for opportunities to serve. Every chance encounter became a chance to offer comfort, hope, or simply a loving presence to someone struggling. His home became a refuge for those in spiritual crisis, a place where wounded souls could find understanding without judgment. His generosity manifested itself not only through material actions, but primarily through the quality of his presence. When Dannion spoke to someone, that person received his absolute and unconditional attention. There were no distractions, no rush, No personal agenda, just the sacred moment of one human being authentically connecting with another. Death, which had previously terrified humanity as the ultimate enemy, had become, in his view, a silent and wise teacher. Each day lived with the awareness of mortality became more precious, more intense, more meaningful. The impermanence of all things, instead of generating despair, created a loving urgency to live each moment to its fullest. His home was filled with books on spirituality, philosophy, and transcendental experiences. Not as a distant academic, but as someone who had tapped directly into the source of all wisdom and now sought ways to share this crystal-clear water with a world thirsting for meaning. And so, day after day, Dannion Brinkley became more and more a living bridge between the material world and the spiritual dimensions, proving that it is possible to live on earth with a heart already touched by heaven. Decades have passed since that fateful day in 1975, when a lightning strike completely transformed Dannion Brinkley's existence, and his extraordinary story has continued to resonate through the years, touching the lives of countless people seeking answers to the mysteries of death and human consciousness. Dannion wrote books detailing his experience, the best known being Saved by the Light, published in the 1990s. His narrative has become one of the most well-known and discussed accounts of near-death experiences in the world, contributing significantly to the growing scientific and popular interest in this type of phenomenon. Over the years, he has given hundreds of interviews for television, radio, and documentaries. His story has been featured on channels like the Discovery Channel and National Geographic, always sparking intense debate among skeptics and those who have had similar experiences. Dannion devoted much of his later life to lecturing at hospitals, universities, and spiritual centers. Many people reported finding comfort in his words, especially those facing their own mortality or having lost loved ones. His core message remained consistent throughout the years. Death is not to be feared, for consciousness continues beyond physical life. His experience also contributed to the growth of scientific research on near-death experiences. Doctors and researchers such as Raymond Moody, Kenneth Ring, and Pim van Lommel began to study these phenomena with greater academic seriousness, collecting thousands of accounts similar to Dannion's. Perhaps the most significant impact of her story was on the way many people began to view death. Healthcare professionals reported changes in their approach to terminally ill patients, and many families found peace in hearing that separation by death might not be final. Dannion continued his mission of sharing his experience until his later years, remaining true to the conviction that he had returned with a specific purpose: to help humanity understand that there is something beyond the physical life we know. His story remains one of the most detailed and impactful testimonies of near-death experiences ever documented, continuing to inspire research, debate, and reflection on the nature of consciousness and the mystery of death. If this extraordinary story touched your heart and made you reflect on the mysteries of life and death, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with people who can benefit from this message of hope. Your interaction helps us bring these transformative stories to even more people who need to hear that there is something greater waiting for us beyond this earthly life. What do you think about experiences like Dannion Brinkley's? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Dannion Brinkley's journey reminds us that some mysteries of human existence remain beyond our complete understanding. But that doesn't stop his stories from deeply touching our hearts and our search for meaning.